Hello and welcome to Setting the Stage, Episode 41, Peter and Tales from Elsewhere, Clockworld. I've seen a lot of growth in the show over the last few months, and I'd like to keep it going. You can help by rating and reviewing the show on your favorite podcast app, telling a friend, or by telling any game masters you know to send in a survey to be on the show. You can find that survey at gocorral.com/STS. That's GOCORRAL.com/STS. And on to the show. Hi, Peter.
Good evening. How you doing?
Good. How are you doing?
Oh, just fine. Our long-awaited meeting.
Yes. Thank you for putting it off for me.
Oh yeah, it's all good.
Did you have a good anniversary?
I did. Nice and quiet. We've been together a long time. We usually don't do anything too fancy. Go out for a night, pretty quiet stuff.
Yeah, my 11th is coming up this weekend.
Congrats.
I don't know. It's a normal date. Nothing that special.
Yeah, when you've been together a long time, you don't necessarily need to mark, every anniversary with something huge, I feel.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, we did something for the 10th that was big,
Mm-hmm.
and now it's like 11. What we're going to celebrate? Was this like the 6th prime number? That's not really something.
Yeah. The 10 year is a fun one. That one's next year for us. And that one will be fun. We'll probably throw a big party or something for that.
Yep. Well, why don't you tell us a bit more about who you are outside of D&D, and then we'll get into the campaign and system stuff after that.
Sounds good. So in my day-to-day life, I'm a software developer. And I do the kind of software development that is not super exciting and sexy. I'm not making games or apps or anything like that.
Oh, no.
No, but I do business logic, database stuff. It's a steady job, well-paying. I work remotely. So it is good, but describing it any further than that will just bore your listeners to sleep.
I'm in the same field now as a project manager, so I could talk about it, but no.
I think you and I could share some horror stories, project management horror stories in an entirely separate podcast.
Yeah. Well, you're right. That's not what we're here for.
We could commiserate later on that one.
Well, what got you started in RPGs?
Well, I started in about the year 2000. So I was visiting some family in the Midwest, and we were in a cabin with no video games, no internet, and my cousin got out his brand new Dungeons & Dragons 3rd edition handbook, and I had never played it before. Introduced it to me that summer, and as soon as I went home, I bought all the books, showed all my friends, and it's just been a central part of my life ever since. So 24 some odd years now.
Oh, cool. And did you play while you were there with your cousin, or?
We did, yeah. We roped in some family, little cousins, a sister, right? Just anybody who wanted to play, and we only had one set of dice between all of us and just one copy of the player's handbook, and my cousin just ran some very silly adventure for us all to partake in. We were teenagers at the time, so it was all nonsense, of course. I remember none of it, except that we all had a really good time just goofing off. And it was so different from playing video games, which I do love as well. But that spontaneity and improvisation and all that was just so eye-opening as a new way to play games.
Yeah, you can really do anything you want.
Yeah, sometimes to the detriment of the story, but that's part of the fun.
Yeah, there's rules that are
Yes.
that's kind of one of them.
Yeah.
So you went back home, and did you start DMing right away when you formed a group
Pretty much,
at home?
yeah. I was the particularly nerdy kid in that I just could memorize these books. I was already playing things like Magic cards, so I was already very in that world, and I took to being the dungeon master very quickly, and running homebrew, mostly inspired by cartoons and movies that I watched, as a teenager is wont to do.
Yep. Yeah, I did the same thing.
For just my immediate friends, just in their bedroom or something, on the couch, or, all the standard early Dungeons & Dragons experiences there.
You're a couch player, not a table player?
Well, we didn't have one to play on there. We just had my friend's room, and he had like a futon, and so we just laid the futon out and put some books down on it or something for hard surfaces, and that's how we started. We basically had no miniatures, no playmats even at the start. We just didn't even know that that was stuff that you needed to get because
Oh yeah.
when I
Hmm.
was shown the game, it was pure theater of the mind. We just didn't have any of that when I was first shown it.
Yeah. No, I got all my miniatures from my dad from when he was playing in the 70s. So I was used to doing that from the start.
Oh, that's awesome. I mean, now I'm the old guy with tons of minis and all the toys and such, but when I started out, I had humble beginnings.
Yes, yes. I was mentioning the table and couch thing because I followed the Knights of the Dinner Table on Facebook, and that was one of the jokes they were making recently, where Knights of the Dinner Table always has the characters in that comic play around the dinner table, and Dork Tower plays around the couch, and they're kind of like taking
Ah,
shots at each other with like single panel
oh,
jokes.
that's funny. You know, now I have like a dedicated game space, right, with its own table and all that. So I'm not even at the dinner table anymore. I've evolved
Ooh,
now that I have a space of my own, right?
the den.
Yep, I've got my man cave or dude dungeon as I like to call it, which sounds
Uh,
worse, but it just has a ring to it.
mhm, yeah. So obviously you've evolved beyond D&D from what I read in your survey, where now you're have your own setting, which is typical, but not just that, you also have your own rule set. Um, so let's talk about like the genesis for that. Like, how did that get started?
So, you know, like I said, I've been playing D&D for a long time, and I started to branch out and try other systems many years ago, just kind of dabbling here and there, you know, GURPS, Mutants and Masterminds, just really trying stuff out to see what other types of game experiences you could get out of
Hmm.
tabletop role playing. As I realized that Dungeons and Dragons and its cousins are all kind of creating the same sort of experience at the end of the day, this high fantasy, very heroic,
Yep.
and you can hack it to try to do other genres or try to do other types of games, but you're kind of working uphill at that point, you know, because
Hmm.
the system itself doesn't necessarily lend itself to other genres. And I wanted
Yes.
something. I'm a big horror and action horror fan, and I wanted something a little grittier. And that's what started. What started out as just trying to hack D&D or hack the original Cyberpunk game, or you know these other systems. It eventually led to just making my own that would serve the very niche purposes I wanted. You know, that very tight corner there that I wanted to occupy that the other games just weren't providing.
Hmm. Well, yeah. Why don't you tell us what your setting is, like just the sort of broad strokes, and then we can get into the rules for it
Yeah,
before
sounds good.
diving deeper for the setting.
Yeah, so the I'm a big fan of the works of H.P. Lovecraft. Obviously, not the works of not the man himself, but you know the cosmic horror that he
Yeah,
created.
there are very few people that like both.
Yeah, yeah. One would wonder why somebody would actually like the guy. He was basically universally unlikable and a terrible person. But anyway,
Uh-huh.
so I like cosmic horror. I like that sort of style of horror, the fear of the unknown and madness and all that. And so I knew I wanted to make a setting that utilized that. But I'm also a fan of Westerns, and I know they're not exactly in vogue these days, but I am just such a huge Western fan and Weird West fan. I wanted to do a Lovecraftian horror Weird West setting.
Hmm.
And I had read Deadlands. You know, Deadlands is great, but it
Yep.
wasn't quite the setting that I wanted to go for. Deadlands is a lot of mysticism and magic and spirits, and I wanted something a little bit more on the sci-fi side of things. So the setting I came up with is called the world is called Clockworld, and the through line of all of these settings, so I actually have a couple of them planned, is called Tales from Elsewhere. Because the genesis idea was there's this place called Elsewhere that is the reality behind our own, you know, the place of unknowable things, the place of madness and evil that occasionally seeps in our nightmares, that drives us to do evil things. So I wanted a setting that involved that plus rootin' tootin' cowboys. So that's where the setting of Clockworld came about. And I'm also a big fan of apocalyptic and post-apocalyptic stories. So the genesis of the setting was, okay, what if there was a Lovecraftian apocalypse in the world? Like, you know, the
Okay.
horror of those stories that destroys most of the world, but in the late 19th century United States. And what what would the stories the players would get to be able to do in that really intrigued me, like that kind of gameplay, that 19th century technology plus a little bit of science fiction plus some cosmic horror. Just really, I don't know, that's just my jam right there. That weird confluence of those three things.
Uh-huh. Yeah. And I feel like that's a pretty versatile setting somewhat, because a lot of like classic horror stories have a very similar setting.
Yeah.
Like Frankenstein is basically the same thing. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
it's not cosmic horror, but it's still horror, and
Oh yeah, and it's the right time period as well. Yeah,
Dracula, a lot of werewolf stories.
yeah, there's a lot of great Victorian era horror, and really a lot of what we consider horror really started in the Victorian era. We can pretty much credit Mary Shelley with creating
Mhm.
that type of horror herself, which is great. And we see that through line up into film. I'm big into film and horror films, especially the classics. So things like Alien, Aliens, The Thing, all those are very much in the same vein of a horror that is the world out there is hostile, or the universe is hostile, right? Space is hostile, or the wilderness is hostile. And I really enjoy those kinds of settings.
Yeah, yeah.
And I knew I wanted a game where it's people versus the monsters out there. In that I've played in Dungeons and Dragons homebrew settings or in games where there's moral ambiguity as to, oh, this goblin camp, they were just being forced to do this by the dragon, right? There's a lot of that sort of gameplay that you get in Dungeons and Dragons where it's sometimes unclear who the bad guy is, and that's part of it, right? You're not supposed to judge people just because they're orcs, they're not evil, and so forth. And I
Yeah, I
know,
can't have that.
yeah, right. And I think that's great for a game like Dungeons and Dragons. What I wanted is where all the players are people, and there's a very clear line that the monsters out there are not people analogs. Like these are nightmarish abominations, right? With no human analog to them. Please shoot them before they kill you and eat your soul, right? That the game is less about that moral ambiguity and more about survival and team and working together, all the people working together to stop these monsters.
Yeah. I feel like there's a lot of similarities there between your setting and Fallout.
Oh, yes, indeed. Another big inspiration. Yeah.
Yeah.
And Fallout is a Western, really. I mean, they hide it a little bit, but it plays out much like Westerns do.
That's what I told my dad when I was telling him to watch the show, was it's the best Western that's been made in a long time.
Yeah, yeah. Sci-fi Westerns. I mean, The Mandalorian is a Western. This Fallout show is a Western. They're sneaking in right here and there. Firefly. Oh, so good. Another Western. I just love them in all their forms, all their weird forms that they come about. And there's not a lot of films made that are Western horror. So there's slim pickings there.
Yeah. I guess Cowboys and Aliens would be one.
Yeah, that's not even really horror, though. It's a little bit. One that is probably the best Western horror, maybe one of the best ones ever made, is called Bone Tomahawk. But I cannot recommend that everybody just go out and watch this movie if they're interested. It is extremely rated R. It is not for the lighthearted. It is very intense. It's very good. Has Kurt Russell in it, Matthew Fox, but viewer discretion heavily advised. Warn people. Very intense movie.
There's this one movie that I've seen that is sort of a Western that combines a horror element. It's called It Stains the Sands Red.
Oh, I love that title. I've not heard of that. I have to make a note about this.
It was a very small release. I'm looking at the box office number right now, $3,599.
Yeah, not a lot of money made there. Oh, this looks great, though.
Yeah. But the plot is that there's this woman that she ends up in the desert chased by a single zombie.
Oh, what a cool setup.
Because her boyfriend gets killed by the zombie, I think, and then she's the car's out of gas, so she can't drive away from it.
Right.
All she can do is run, but it doesn't sleep, and she needs to sleep, and it's also in the desert.
Yeah,
so
okay, say no more.
Shade.
I will watch this. I want to know no more. I'm sold so hard on this movie now.
Yeah. And then it's got other like flashback sequences and
Yeah,
stuff to
yeah.
build up her
What a
backstory.
creative premise, though. I will absolutely track this down and watch
Yeah,
it.
yeah, I thought it was super cool.
Another really tiny film, very independent, was called Exit Humanity, which is technically questionable if it's a Western, as it takes place during the Civil War in America, and it's about a zombie apocalypse that starts right in the middle of like the Battle of Gettysburg. And it's about a lone soldier, right? The soldiers all just start rising again. It's kind of like in Deadlands. Deadlands has that sort of thing. But
Right.
it's about this lone soldier just trying to travel across, America, trying to make it to safety. And it wasn't great, as a lot of these very tiny projects, tend to be, but still very cool. And I commended its creativity. Like I said, I'm desperate for horror westerns. There's not a lot.
Well, another thing that your setting was vaguely reminding me of in tone was the Dark Tower series.
Another huge inspiration.
All right.
I'm a big fan of the Dark Tower series. I trudged through all 3,000 pages in total that series has. I don't even remember. And I'm generally a Stephen King fan. I would say, yeah, it's quite good. Definitely one of my big inspirations for the setting. I joke about if Stephen King wants, I'll do a pen and paper adaptation of his books if he wants to give me that license.
Yeah, it feels like from what you've described, like the Dark Tower setting is really just Clockworld, but like later on, somewhat like after things have fallen apart even more.
Yeah, yeah, it's inspired a lot by Roland's World, and I'm blanking on the names as it's been many years since I read the full series.
I think that's what they call it. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. So Roland, where Roland comes from, Gilead and all that, where the world has moved on, right? There's all this ancient technology still puttering around, and it's dangerous, and there's these gunslingers, and oh yeah, all that's seared into my brain, all that imagery.
Okay. Well, I think we've given the listeners a good snapshot of what the world is like, and I do want to get deeper on that later on.
Yeah.
But let's talk about the mechanics that you've designed that fit this better than just D20 with the serial numbers filed off.
Right. So something that I've become disenfranchised with over the years, I guess you could say, is hit points in tabletop role-playing games.
Mm-hmm.
Most games use some version of hit points, and I find them to be narratively uninteresting. And when you are trying to make a horror game or something with a lot of tension to it, it's tough when, as an example, I'm going to pick on Dungeons and Dragons a bit. I love Dungeons and Dragons. I'm going to pick on one a bit here.
You know how it is. Swing high.
Yep. So the zombie in Dungeons and Dragons is not a zombie to me. So the zombie in Dungeons and Dragons walks up to you and hits you for what, a D6 plus 2 bludgeoning damage as it slams you. It's just not evocative at all. Even if it was a bite, I take 5 points of damage, end of story. I wanted to use an injury system that was a bit more evocative for that as one of the core systems. And so there are no hit points in the game. And this is where if it was on a whiteboard, I would draw my injury tracker. Instead, characters can receive a certain number of injury, and they have ascending severity from a serious injury to a critical injury, lethal injury, and death. And when you...
There's a separation between lethal and death.
Yeah, lethal is like being downed. You've received a lethal injury. You're, in Dungeons and Dragons, you'd be at 0 hit points. That's what a lethal injury is. In my game, you can still crawl pathetically while bleeding out in that state, just for the dramatic effect of it.
Uh-huh.
But the way that the system works is when you successfully have hit somebody, we need to go into all that mechanic because the injury is the most important part. But if I hit, you pick up a number of dice based on how good you are with that weapon. So if it's a revolver, I'd use marksmanship. That's the skill. And the size of the dice I roll is based on the weapon. So if I'm a master marksman, I get 4 dice for injury rolls, and a revolver is a D8. So I'd roll 4 8-sided dice and look for the lowest number. If it's a 1, I inflict a critical injury. If it's a 2 or a 3, a serious injury. And if it's a 4 or higher, I just strain them, which is like a graze.
Okay.
And there's no additions or subtractions there. Now, a player can only receive 2 serious injuries, 1 critical injury, and 1 lethal injury. If you don't have a box to write the injury in, you write it in the next lowest box. So after 2 serious injuries, a third serious injury results in a critical, so on and so forth.
Okay, that's sounding very similar to the Blades in the Dark system for how it does
Yes.
harm.
Yep. The Blades in the Dark, excellent. It's not here on my desk right now. Excellent game. I think there's a lot to take from it that's really good. The other wrinkle is that the injuries all come with a complication to them, usually denoted by the weapon. For example, gunshots would leave bleeding injuries. So there's a box that you write in next to that injury. So you have, okay, I've taken a serious gunshot. You then write in bleeding in that injury slot. You have to treat each injury individually. So to stop the bleeding, you need to go treat that one injury. And once you do, the bleeding stops.
Mm-hmm.
And you can target on the body, both on the player and the enemies, whether to shoot them center mass, which I call the bulk, a limb, which I call the brim, or something like the head, which is the ace. So the players can choose to injure the zombie's limb, like shoot their leg out as they approach, and the zombie will fall and be slowed down. These kinds of things are like really classic tropes in action horror movies, right? In The Walking Dead, they're either trying to slow the zombies down by taking out a leg or just shooting them in the head.
Or like the Dead Space game, that's like the whole point.
Exactly. Because in D&D, the zombie, its immortality is really just it rolls a Constitution saving throw when it would die, and if it gets like a 10 or more, it doesn't die. So that's also, I don't think, that cool. In my game, the zombie can only be killed with a critical injury to the head, which also makes sense, right? Narratively, when you tell that to people. Like, oh, yeah, I've watched The Walking Dead. I shoot him in the head. That's actually what you do to destroy the zombie.
And are the different injury types, are those tracked as a whole for a character, or are they tracked for each individual body part?
They're tracked as a whole for the character, and there's a spot to write where that injury is located on the body, like a leg or the chest and so forth.
Okay, so the safest way to kill a zombie would be to like shoot 2 of its legs with severe injuries and then aim for the head now for the
Yeah, that would be, especially if you're not a great shot, if in case you roll only a serious injury, and since because you can still get a critical result on any attack, you can skip right ahead, so to speak. Additionally, the head on most creatures is vulnerable. And what that means is the result of whatever injury you get when you attack it is upgraded 1 step.
Okay.
So, and if something's resistant, like if something was armored, it does the opposite of that. It reduces it 1 step. So it plays out as people kind of expect from, say, The Walking Dead, or if they've played video games like that where you need to shoot zombies in the head, the head is vulnerable, go for the head. It's harder to hit, but if you can hit it, it's very deadly to do so. And so the fights are actually very fast. There's no attrition really going on. The limbs start flying, right? Blood starts spraying everywhere. People are dying. It's over very quickly. Usually in 3 to 4 turns, a fight will be well solved at that point.
Yeah, it makes you really value armor if you can get your hands on it too.
Yeah, it makes players play a little bit more defensively, as they should. You can very much control the likelihood of being hit in my game. It uses a D10 rather than a D20, so there's tighter percentages, less variance. We don't have to dig into a ton of the math stuff there, but long story short, the players are very in control of their success and failure in my game, as they can stack things in their favor very easily, like advantages, so that they'll be very aware, okay, if I do this, I know I have like a 90% chance to hit. They'll be able to determine that fairly easily. So it's about making those decisions to set it up, right, to get that good hit, and then you'll take down the creature, potentially in 1 good shot to the head.
Yeah, it also, I feel like it makes sense for them protecting themselves from other ranged characters, because then they need to take cover.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, every character you can take reactions every round that everybody can do. It's not a class-based game either, and we can maybe talk about that in a bit, but everybody can dive for cover. Everybody can try to dodge something. Everybody can try to block something, and it's recommended that you do try to dive for cover if somebody's going to try to shoot at you, right? Getting shot sucks.
Right. I'm just sort of digging into your inspiration for the system here. Were you looking at Cthulhuian or Boot Hill when you were thinking of this like different body part injury system?
I think Cyberpunk was the one I first looked at about injuring different body parts, as I did like some of the targeting they did there. Yeah, Boot Hill, I definitely flipped through and thought, yeah, that's the direction I wanted to go. But I wanted it all to be tracked fairly quickly, as a lot of, I think, limb targeting or special targeting games get a little bogged down with all the targeting. And so
Mhm.
there's a lot of, I would say, mathematic simplicity to my game. There's not a lot of stacking modifiers. The arithmetic stays like single digit a lot of the
Oh,
time.
sorry, it's not Cthulhuian. I was thinking of the like parody name they have for it. Aces and Eights.
Oh, I've heard of that.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, all those kinds of bodily harm injury systems
Hmm.
where you can target parts of the body. I decided to abstract it a little bit with just bulk, brim, and ace is the
Uh,
way the rules present it, so that you can template it onto things that don't have necessarily a human analog.
right. Yeah, that would be difficult for like a worm
Yeah,
or
yeah,
yeah.
or like an ooze. There's an ooze monster in the game. It's a puddle of radioactive human flesh, but it
Oh,
has
great.
only a bulk, no ace or brim.
Hmm.
Makes
Yep.
sense. It's just a blob,
Yep.
and that's fairly logical.
Yeah, and I guess that's also easy for you to mess with the monsters by like that one could like for obviously like zombies would ignore like the bleeding condition, for example.
Absolutely. Yep.
Or the you could have a monster that has like four severe checkboxes.
Yep. A big part of the playtesting that I've done is I've run a couple long-term campaigns, the same campaign with different groups to focus test, was refining the number of injuries. Even more so than tweaking hit point numbers, the number of injury boxes I give these creatures wildly changes the way the players have to interact with them. So that's been very informative over time.
Mhm.
You can have, for example, a basic bandit. I think in the current draft, they have one serious injury box, no critical injury boxes, and one lethal injury box. So what that actually means is one critical hit to a bandit and they drop down and are bleeding out, right? They're like a mook. And so by skipping the critical box and going straight to lethal, you get the whole, you shoot the guy up on the banister of the saloon and he falls over and down to the table, right? Just one hit takes him out.
Yeah, yeah.
While,
I think if you're trying to have that more like Western feel, where the main characters are these amazing gunslingers, then you need enemies like that.
yeah, yeah. And then you have really big beasties or strange things that don't template as well or very difficult or start, or their injuries can treat themselves right automatically or get removed, all that kind of stuff. What's fun is that because there's these individual injuries and I don't have any healing, like there's no healing in the game,
Hmm.
it makes things that automatically treat an injury just really gnarly. There's a narcotic derived from a monster that a player can inject. I play Hunt Showdown, so I love the idea of injecting yourself with these weird things, um, where it automatically treats all the injuries you have. Doesn't remove the injury from your sheet, but the complications go away. So, like, your
Uh,
leg gets broken and it pops back in at the start of your turn, right? Or you get this big slash and it just closes on its own. So it's very kind of gruesome and evocative, even the support items in that way.
okay. Well, it reminds me of the foot in Fallout where that gets healed.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
I wanted I wanted the injuries to have some consequence. So treating an injury doesn't remove it from the sheet, it just prevents the complications. So your boxes still get filled up over time,
And you
even though
still
your
have to
injuries are
heal
treated.
it later on with like
Yeah.
getting your bones set or
Yep.
something.
You downtime, right? I don't have short rest, long rest. I went with a breather and a reprieve. So you have to basically make it back to town somewhere safe to get what we would call a long rest.
Uh,
Remove the injuries requires you to not be out in the wilderness fighting off horrors. You need to make it back, get some bed rest, get some whiskey.
yeah.
The
I,
usual
I
cowboy
like that
stuff.
though, like having the terms that you use in game being like evocative of what the setting is, even
Yeah,
if it is functionally the same.
right, exactly. And I wanted I'm just thinking about trying to make it really Western. I knew I wanted there to be consumables, and I wanted them to feel Wild West. And so there's no healing potions or any of that, but you can like take a shot of whiskey and it emboldens you for a turn and removes like one strain.
Hmm.
Or using tobacco will calm you and prevent you from being distracted. You can take laudanum and all sorts of other weird,
Yeah.
19th century remedies.
Cocaine for your
Yeah,
gums. Yeah.
exactly. And they all have drawbacks, of course. Just and in the playtest, what's been really entertaining is after a really nasty fight, all these characters, they all pull out their flasks of whiskey or roll a cigarette, right? They calm down afterward with
Yeah.
authentic Wild West consumables, and there's
Uh-huh.
something that tickles me about that.
Yeah, that's good. I like that.
Yeah.
It's good that you're like you give a small mechanical benefit that encourages it.
Yeah,
That's cool.
it helps recover things. You can recover your strain, I call it, which is both mental and physical duress. There's just a couple check boxes for that. You don't like write something in,
Mhm.
and taking a shot of whiskey can remove one strain, or all these sort of over-the-counter goofy remedies are a way to mitigate that, even if they don't remove your injuries.
I'm curious about the character generation for like the player side. Um, so can you talk a little about that? Let's do like a sort of I don't know how many
Yeah.
steps it is, but like just quick run through the different steps for that.
Absolutely. So I knew that I just wanted one species in my game, really, just people effectively.
Hmm.
And I also knew that I didn't want to do classes per se. So the way it works is you pick a profession, a culture, and an incident. And each of these have more or less equivalent bearing on your character. Your profession isn't a character class. Your culture um, isn't necessarily where you grew up, but it could be something that was a big part of your life. Each of these three choices gives you a set of skills that you can pick from, as well as a set of edges, which are like feats, and they give you starting equipment. And that's just where you start off. And in my game, your skills, which are this is the only number you add when you're doing a skill test, like
Uh-huh.
shooting a gun is a skill test, climbing a wall is a skill test. These these values are actually set at character creation, and they do not scale up over time. How good you are at things is from a lifetime of doing that, and a week out in the wilderness is not going to suddenly make you a master marksman. Instead, characters progress horizontally by basically getting more class features, but it's from a big smorgasbord of options that they're only limited to when they first make their character. So if you want to have a Deadeye Ed, a Deadeye feat basically when you make your character, you had to have been an outlaw or a lawman or something that actually learned how to do that.
Uh-huh.
But after character creation, as you progress, you can just start picking them from wherever. So you make these characters that were a saloon owner or a grave digger, they're not all like heroic professions. They're just things people do to survive, farmer, so on and so forth. Culture places you within the world itself. You can be from certain places. You could have grown up, for example, among the salt of the earth, right? You were a farmer or something like that. You could be from a city. And
Uh-huh.
these also give you skills and edge options. And then your inciting incident is things like you're on the hunt. Something was taken from you and you're trying to track it down. It gives you these features. And or you lost it all, from gambling, and here are the features you gain from that. It's why you're out in the world seeking something. And like I said, each one of these basically has just as much bearing on your build as any of the others.
Um, this is sounding like the injury system and now this character creation system very similar to the Iron Claw game. Have you read that?
Oh, I haven't. Ironclaw, huh? I was thinking Iron Sworn, but you're talking about a different one, right?
Yeah, yeah. Iron Claw is different. It's a game where you play anthropomorphic animals. Um, and so everything there is anthropomorphic animals. Then it's
Sure.
vaguely European, Renaissance setting. And you pick a species instead of a culture, but it's basically the same thing.
Right.
And a profession, and they each give you a set of skills and edges. Um,
Yeah.
and then you have sort of free points after that, whereas you have this inciting incident thing, which sounds very mechanically motivating for players, I guess, because usually you can sort of have people that make a character that maybe doesn't make sense for them to be adventuring by accident,
Right.
and this puts it right up front, like, no, you need to be someone that wants to participate, and you need to come up with a reason why, and here's some reasons, and they have mechanical things that happen with them too.
Yeah, exactly. And they're tied directly to the world. One of the cultures would be, you were a member of the Hundred Blue, which is the ubiquitous bandit organization, right? That's part of your culture. Or one of the incidents would be you escaped one of the Blood Oiler pits, and Blood Oilers are one of the real nasty monsters. And your incident was you escaped this and you're haunted by what you saw, and that puts you out in the world. You're changed forever by it. So yeah, it's been fun. I like when character creation isn't a series of disconnected decisions, but you're building a narrative over time with the character, right? Okay, what did I do? I was a saloon owner. What was my culture? Maybe I'm from the big city, and and then I lost it all, or I survived a raid. All that sets up it jump starts my role play a little bit, because each of those things is an important decision. Where like I feel like in D&D sometimes your background. I mean, they're fixing it up a bit in the new edition, the new half edition. But your background kind of doesn't matter. It's like, yes, I was a scholar, but I mean, it doesn't really do much.
And the backgrounds in D&D are also very malleable because generally it's like you get 3 proficiencies, and you can
Right.
you can usually talk to your DM and say like, I want to be this background that gets these 2 proficiencies, but I want to swap the third one for something, and it's fine.
Right.
Like,
And
no one
usually
cares.
it's like, yeah, whatever. Yeah. In my game, there's no swapping of the proficiencies. So if you want to be somebody who can take marksmanship as one of their skills, there's 11 skills, by the way. You have to have taken a backstory element that involved weapons training of some sort, right? You needed to have been a bandit, maybe, or um, one of the inciting incidents on the hunt gives you marksmanship as an option. You're out there to kill somebody, right? So you've learned how to use a gun. But
Yeah.
if you've chosen, I don't know, saloon owner from the big city who's just wandering the world, and nowhere in that backstory are you a deadly gunslinger. So, you won't be shooting guns very effectively.
Yeah. Well, I think that's part of that is with only 11 skills, which is often easier to manage. It also means that you need to control them that way as well.
Yeah.
So I think D&D proficiencies, like, there's so many weapons, and then there's armor and shields and
Right. Yeah.
languages, tools, skill proficiencies, and then, there's
Yeah.
a whole bunch of stuff that builds from there.
Yeah, they layer systems. My game, it's just the skills. I don't even have attributes separate from them. There's
Mm.
just these 11 skills, and there's no armor proficiency. If you want to wear the armor, it just has a weight to it. I have an encumbrance system. So, yeah, you'll just be weighed down a bit by wearing the heavy armor, but I mean, metal armor doesn't do much against a bullet, so it's not really advised most of the time to clank around in a suit of plate armor or something, right? Because guns just go right through them. But yeah.
Were revolvers able to puncture metal plates?
Oh
I mean,
yeah. Well,
I guess it depends on what period, because I know like this is coming off of late 1800s for the sort of steampunk feel to it, but it's also post-apocalypse where maybe we've got souped-up guns now.
yeah. Well, so the old ball and cap firearms, even in the before times, even well before that, were able to puncture what plate armor was made of. So metal armor just did very little for a long time to stop firearms. It has too much piercing power to it, and has for a couple centuries now. Yeah, so metal armor doesn't really stop a bullet, and so it's useful when you're fighting. I don't know, a creature with fangs and claws, right? Because it can prevent it from scratching you or from somebody stabbing you. But armor is more of a choice, like a tactical choice in my game, rather than I'm a fighter, I put on my plate armor. It's like we're gonna go fight some nasty beasties. Let's all put on something to protect against their teeth. That'd be more of how you'd approach it.
What was that one Western movie where Clint Eastwood wore like a plate armor underneath his poncho?
Oh, when does he do that?
It's got to be Fistful of Dollars or For a Few Dollars, but
Yeah,
I just
yeah. So
forgot
like
which one.
reinforced, like modern reinforced steel, like a steel plate, could possibly absorb the impact of something like that, but you couldn't realistically wear a suit of armor.
Yeah, yeah.
Right? Yeah. I do have a bullet vest. You can wear an expensive piece that protects just your bulk makes you resistant to firearms and to, I think I have it, resistant to firearms and bashing. So if you're just expecting to be shot in the chest, you could wear something like that, but it doesn't stop something that pierces, right? In real life, bulletproof vests, you can kind of stab through them. That's sometimes why they put extra plates behind them, yada, yada, yada.
Right.
Yeah, I'm going for a little simpler than the armor layering in that way. I had a draft of that at one point where I was like, well, what if you could layer armor and have different armor on different parts of your body? And I thought, that's a pain. Just, are you wearing a bulletproof vest or not? We'll kind of leave it there.
Yeah, I've seen layered armor systems, or the ones that use different. Like layered just seemed okay. It's like you just add them together, kind of, and now you have more bulk or more weight. But ones that do like different parts of your body just feel very complicated to track, even though it's more realistic. And it just doesn't seem worth it to me.
Yeah, it gets a little complicated. And armor in my games, it's like damage reduction, kind of like we were saying earlier. So you don't have an armor class that you're trying to hit. How hard it is to hit something is purely based on how far away it is and what you're targeting. And if they don't want to be shot, they need to go take cover or block if they want to avoid being stabbed. It's not hard to actually, person standing a few feet from you and you're holding a knife, it's kind of hard to miss them. Like to swing and like literally hit nothing. In Dungeons and Dragons, your armor class is an abstraction of your ability to dodge as well, though, right? That's what it's representing, that your body.
Right.
My game, you actively try to dodge it. You have to use reactions and such.
Right. So you mentioned the skills and marksman. There's only 11. You want to just list them out?
Oh, sure. So these skills are acuity, athletics, bravado, brawling, dexterity, discipline, guile, marksmanship, melee, might, and reflexes. So it's a very different list than what Dungeons and Dragons uses or a lot of games. For example, charisma is not a single skill. I have both bravado and guile, and they represent different things than charisma does on its own. I've always felt charisma kind of got the short end of the stick on what it represents. It's just like, are you handsome and charming? And people who are very charming and good talkers aren't necessarily good liars. And people who are crafty and sneaky and witty aren't necessarily good leaders. And that's all been one thing in a lot of games. So bravado in my game is your ability to lead, to intimidate, inspire, but it is also controls one of your passive defenses. It's how resistant you would be to fear as well, because it's tied into your bravery. While guile is more like how well you are at manipulating others through lying, charming them, using logic. And you can actually use guile to stealth in my game. You can sneak with guile, because it's also your ability to know how to sneak up on people. My game, multiple skills let you do the same thing so that builds can be a little bit more diverse. So reflexes or guile can be used to sneak, for example. But guile doesn't make you more brave, so it doesn't help your grit defense, as an example. Some of them are pretty self-explanatory. Melee and marksmanship, there's just two weapon proficiency skills. Melee is for fighting in melee, weapons, shields, and then marksmanship's for anything ranged.
Right.
I have a distinct brawling skill, which is for wrestling and punching and improvised weapons. Athletics is for moving yourself, how you'd run and jump and climb. Dexterity would be things like using a lasso, picking a lock, that kind of stuff.
Right.
Discipline is resistance to fear, how easy you are to manipulate from others. It's kind of a catch-all defensive skill. Might is pretty self-explanatory. Can you lift heavy things? Yep. Can you endure a lot of pain? Yeah, so they're pretty fun. It took a while to iterate them down to things that I felt were evocative for the setting. But I like them. I don't have intelligence, I guess. I don't actually have an intelligence. I have acuity, which is your senses and your intellect.
I feel like guile also kind of fits into what we would consider to be intelligence. I also don't like a raw intelligence stat usually.
and I think we overvalue the the mathematical capability of intelligence. Like it's I think it's more interesting when you break it apart a bit into more active uses. Like guile is active, right? Um, it's what you do with it.
I see.
So
Yes.
yeah, you kind of see what I'm saying. And I
Hmm.
don't in intelligence. I don't have a knowledge roll that you have to make. It's not a skill test based on your backstory choices, like culture, profession,
Hmm.
incident. You just have various subjects that you're either familiar with or an expert in, and you just know things based on that. The
Yeah.
GM can say, "Hey, any of you expert in robotics?" And you say, "Oh yeah, my tinkerer is." Okay, you know this, this, and this. There's not a random chance of knowing something.
Yes, I feel like that's more useful for storytelling as well, because then if you want to give a clue to the players, you can just do it instead of having it
Right?
be
Yeah.
sort of locked
It's like, oh, they
by.
rolled a one on their Arcana check, so I guess they don't learn this clue that I spent a lot of time writing.
Hmm. Yep. Yep.
For monsters as well, it means I call them threats rather than monsters because it could be people or monsters. But anyway,
Right.
in the threat entry, there's just a spot that says what knowledges are applicable and what you know if you're familiar or an expert in them about that creature. So you could just tell the player those things. If you're some sort of monster hunter, badass, um, you can have knowledge about that and know that when you encounter these creatures, it's not a chance of rolling a one and you know nothing about them. You'll be able to know things, and that's really powerful and powerful and cool.
Oh, cool.
Yeah,
And you also mentioned edges as sort of little special abilities. So can you give it like two or three examples?
sure. Basically, edges are like class features, right? But they're just broken out into a big uh, smorgasbord of them. There's currently 130 that I've written
Woo!
across 10 categories. And some examples would be things like a fan the hammer edge, lets you shoot your revolver more times on your turn, right?
Right.
Pretty classic stuff. There's survival edges that, like, as you gain more injuries, you become harder to hurt. Pretty standard stuff.
Interesting.
Yeah, playing into that injury system. There's some that tie into inflicting injuries on others. There's, like, for example, one called Bloodlust. You high roll, like have advantage to attack in melee characters that are bleeding. And so it makes you want to inflict bleeding injuries on people to be more accurate against them. There's also a whole bunch of wild supernatural edges because there is, supernatural element to the game. So there's
Right.
some that lets you sprout a bunch of tentacles from your back temporarily that help you fight.
Oh,
Some,
it's just temporary. Thank God.
yeah, just temporary. And so, well, the way it works is, I mentioned you have these strain boxes that represent duress, kind of
Uh-huh.
like phrases. When you use these transformation edges, every turn you tick off a strain automatically and you revert to your normal form when you're exhausted, when you're out of strain. So there's one that makes you turn, it's called Monstrous Transformation. You turn into this big creature that gets these rending claws and you can terrify things and move really fast, but it
Sounds like
exhausts you very quickly.
Deadlands to me.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. And then but you run out of steam very quickly because you'll be strained a lot. And you'll have to, drink yourself back to uh feeling okay afterward.
Okay, cool.
Because strain is a little easy to recover. Let's see. The way crafting is done via edges. The way it works is you pick an edge like, say, demolitionist. It basically says, okay, during any rest, you can craft one of the below items, and you just make it. There's no crafting materials or cost. You just put it together. So you can make a stick of dynamite or a grenade or something, and you just
Yeah, I
make
was
that one
thinking
thing.
what edges you had that weren't combat focused, because ones you've mentioned so far have
Yeah,
been
yeah,
kind
those
of
are
like that.
all pretty direct violence stuff. But crafting edges, you there's a bunch of them. There's 13 of them right now. And the way crafting edges work is during your rest, whenever you rest, which would be a breather or reprieve, you
Right.
craft a number of items equal to the number of crafting edges you've taken, chosen from among all the items you have from your crafting edges. So if you take Demolitionist and Moonshiner and Sanctifier, these are three different crafting edges. You could choose to make three different items. I can make 3 sticks of dynamite, 3 flasks of booze, 3 flasks of holy water, or any combination of 3 from any of my crafting edges. So you can supply the party with a lot of materials, because there is a lot of scarcity in the game. It's apocalyptic. Vendors don't always have these items, or you won't have enough money for them. So somebody that can jury rig and make things can really help out, as they're quite powerful, all these consumables and such.
Okay, cool.
There's things that let you help treat the injured better. Your usual support options, melee options, right? There's some cybernetic things where you can replace limbs with fun gadgets. I'm inspired a lot by certain songs. So, for example, there's one called Friends in Low Places, and it basically lets you spend 1 luck, which is a meta currency that I'll talk about in a second, because I did some fun stuff with this. You can spend 1 luck to basically have a gun hand appear in the scene just in the nick of time to help you out. Like, good thing you knew this one bandit who was in the area, and he just shows up.
It's the mysterious stranger.
Exactly. There's some fun stuff like that, right? Where the player has a lot of control over, hey, I do have a friend that could come help us. I chose this feature that lets me do that, right? Most of the edges are combat focused, as the game is like a survival action horror game where you're going to be,
right,
running from monsters and such. But a lot of them are generically useful in, like, say, Friends in Low Places. There's some that let you prevent Sanctifier is a crafting edge that lets you bless the dead so that they can't rise as undead. So you just have this role play tool now that you can do. You know how to bless things, which is fun.
And you use that during a breather?
Yeah, you could just do that. The crafting part you can do during a breather, but being able to bless the dead, you could just do that. It's at any time. No limit on how many times you can do it. That's just a thing you can do now. I tried to make the crafting edges have some oomph to them, where they all have a passive, like a benefit you gain even when you're not crafting, because a lot of people shy away from crafting, because it's less razzle dazzle than fan the hammer or sniper shots or something, right?
Right, yeah. I've had that experience too.
Yeah, they're a little pushed, I guess, and on purpose. I wanted them to be really cool. Moonshiner's a funny one. Its passive benefit is you can drink more alcohol before getting sick, which makes sense if you're a moonshiner, because alcohol helps recover strain, but you can only drink so much of it. Yeah. So that's its passive benefit, which is actually pretty useful, as alcohol is inexpensive and useful, but you can only drink so much of it before you start getting sick.
Well, let's shift to talking about the setting now. So you've got, is it actually America after Cthulhu came up and destroyed everything, or is this more like a fantasy kind of setting that's not in North America?
Yeah. At first, I was just going to straight up pick a part of North America to use, and then I decided that was a little restrictive. So instead, it is a world not unlike our own, is how I'm phrasing it, right? It's Earth. It's not necessarily beholden to the exact details of our history or our places and names of things. And by divorcing it of that, it let me be a little bit more free. It roughly takes place, to use the real world parallel, the whole known world is just between the Gulf of Mexico and the Great Lakes. Everything outside of that is assumed destroyed in the campaign setting. So it's not a lot of territory there. That is what's left of human civilization to the knowledge of the players. I just don't call it the Great Lakes or the Gulf of Mexico. All of them. I've been giving things different names and so forth.
Yeah, I saw the Chesapeake River as one of them.
Yeah, right. It's all meant to, I'm tipping my hat or winking. Everybody knows what that's supposed to be, right? It's gesturing toward existing things. I've got indigenous tribes that are inspired by groups that were in these various regions, but I'm not going to use their name specifically, right? I'm going to gesture toward it and be inspired by it, but not, you're not going to interact with the Choctaw or the Comanche or anything like that. Yeah. I've got the Wazte, the Oskaloosa, and the Chesapeake, of which the river is named after. So it's not our world, but you can pretty much assume all of the normal trappings of the 19th century that you'd expect visually.
Okay.
Yeah.
Is it like a sort of colonized area like the U.S. is, or is it Because you mentioned like native tribes, so I'm curious if that part of the history is still there.
So the way I present it is, yeah, there were European settlers that moved west, but I want it to paint a slightly less horrible depiction of this world. I don't want to inherit, basically, I don't want to inherit all the racism and xenophobia because it's not the point of my story. So
Not
these
that kind of horror.
yeah, right. There's enough of there's enough of that kind of horror in the real world. I think I wrote in one of the intro pages of the book, it says something like, "The horrors of the ruination will not discriminate, and nor should you."
Good line.
Um, yeah, yeah, because it's about people banding together to survive. So yeah, there are people of European descent who have colonized that area, but there's not an antagonistic relationship with the indigenous people. And for example, the Oskaloosa in the north basically run one of the counties there. Because I wanted to, in the NPCs, there's people of Irish descent or Irish gesture, Chinese gesture, African American gesture. Because these are the people that like built the country, right?
Oh yeah.
People immigrating, some being taken. So I wanted to make sure that I'm again tipping my hat toward the people that built like the nation in that time period.
Okay. And so we still have like a Great Lakes kind of thing and a
Yep.
Gulf of Mexico kind of thing that are framing with similar industries. Like, does the South have cotton, tobacco, and Great Lakes have the fur trade going on?
There's a lot of that has been destroyed, and so it's not a lot of civilization in those open spaces. So what basically has allowed this area to survive, narratively speaking, was there were some major firearm manufacturing places. And
Okay.
that's how people stayed alive in this swath, is that there were a lot of guns and people were able to hold things off. The way I have it right now is there's three counties, one in the south, one in the middle, and one in the north. The northern one, its main export is things like lumber and furs, like the Great Lakes would be. In the
Right.
middle, where you're more in the plains area, it's where a lot of food is going to be able to be produced. And in the south, it's where things like oil can still be harvested and utilized, to try to still run, trying to still use crude oil such that it is. So yeah, that's kind of how it roughly plays out, but they're mostly still in survival mode. The players play the game 100 years after the day of the apocalypse, roughly.
Okay.
And so people have bounced back a bit, but they really just have this one narrow swath of what is that, about 1,000 miles, right, from the Gulf to the Great Lakes. And to the left and right, to the east and west, nothing but nightmare. So they're holding on dear in that little stretch there, and not much else outside it. But that's where the adventures take place, right? You have to venture out into what I
Right.
call the ruination for various reasons.
Okay. So that means like no one really remembers what the world was like before the apocalypse.
Yeah, there's very little knowledge of what everything was. I mean, we're holding on to some of the technology still, but because it's a weird west, humans had hit a higher technological point in the before times. And so going out into these ruins, you'll find they call pre-calamity technology or wondrous technology, which could be like a nuclear reactor. Very Fallout, right? So you're going out
Ooh.
there and you can discover powerful technology or dangerous technology, which is very valuable. But you may not know how to use it, but you could bring it back. It'd be worth a lot of money. Problem is, it's usually surrounded by mutated monsters, all like Fallout.
Right.
So danger abounds. The big playtest campaign that I ran for the three groups involved attempting to settle a new colony out in the wilderness. So the players were tasked with they joined a wagon train, just heading out into the ruination, trying to make it to a scouted town and settle there, and all the misadventure that happened along the way.
One element I'm curious about is like what uh, art has survived. 'Cause it sounds like this is a world that's on the verge of having like movies be a part of it before the apocalypse,
Yeah,
and
they had that.
cameras would certainly be around.
Yeah, they the survivors. have the photograph, but not the movie. But oddly, there's still like automatons made from the before times that they've been maintaining. People don't really know how to make a lot of this stuff, but in classic kind of post-apocalyptic way, they're trying to maintain what they've inherited from that prior culture. But it's a weird juxtaposition of, the means of conveyance is still the horse, but you could see like robots laying train track down. These rickety, rusty old robots from the before times that somebody's managed to keep running.
Yeah. And I guess tracks would still be used in mines because they're still useful in that circumstance.
Yeah. And they have a couple trains running that they've refurbished, and God bless them, they just keep having to fix them up, and they trundle along as best they can, just to connect these little areas together. But it's obviously very dangerous because there's large stretches of uninhabited land between these pockets of civilization. So, classic, you're riding on the train and monsters attack it, classic stuff.
Yeah. So one of the things that I feel like a lot of, there's this question that has to be answered is how does trade work if it's too dangerous to travel between communities? Like, how can you have truly specialized economies if, there's a 50% chance that you die traveling between
flip
them.
A coin, yeah. Well, each of the 3 counties is mostly self-sufficient for its day-to-day survival, roughly. But there's just not enough food across all 3, so they do need to try to ship some of it out. And it's why these trains are often, they try to make them well guarded. It'd be a common quest, I guess you could say, for players to try to guard a train as it transports things. Like mutation-free cattle is really valuable, so if they want to ship that, where they can. Yeah, it's very dangerous to do it. And
oh man, a train robbery is classic, but instead it's like, vampire bats that are trying to drink the blood of the cows on the train.
Exactly, because it's, these are mutation-free beef. They'd be really expensive. And there's a governor that runs each of these 3 counties. They put a lot of resources into trying to protect these supply routes as best they can, because the ambitions of man, right? We're trying to rebuild and expand again, and it doesn't always work. Yeah, it's a big reason why you have to have armed people on trains, right? It's just to try to stop that from happening.
So the 3 counties, what are the rough splits there, and do they kind of line up for what those regions are within the U.S. culturally as well?
There's some pretty direct parallels. So the northern county is called Vale County, and that's your Midwest. When you're talking about the Great Lakes, it comes up against a large mountain range called the Oskaloosa Range. And all of these things follow the Chesapeake River to the east. So it's like things bordering the Mississippi. So Vale County's in the north, and that's where you get things like lumber, you get trapping. They actually don't go to they're called the Spider Lakes. They actually don't go over to the lakes much because it's one of the danger zones. It's very dangerous there. Whatever is in those lakes is not friendly. But they run right up against that. South of them is Langstrom County, and that is getting a little bit more to be like Oklahoma, North Texas, maybe. We're starting to get more plains. It's very arable land. And then in the south is the Gulf County, and that's like straight up Arizona, the South Texas, right? Things bordering the Gulf of Mexico.
Okay.
More arid there. They basically are sheltered. This area has a mighty river to its east, and that's helps protect these 3 counties as it's a natural barrier against threats.
You got to have those like classic desert western towns that produce nothing and no one knows why they exist there.
Oh, 100%. Oh yeah. And they'll have some name in Spanish, right? That is probably butchered, right? Nobody's pronouncing it correctly, and there's just one church, right? Oh yeah.
Yeah, I'm thinking of High Noon right now. I forget what the name of that town is.
Oh yeah, I'm blanking too. That's all right. Yeah, that's a good one though. I have a lot of fun coming up with names for towns, because some sound like a city, like Langstrom City. That sounds like a place. You got to have Chesapeake City to be like, something in Mississippi or New Orleans. I have some Spanish ones like Puesta del Sol or Estancia Quemada that just sound like Western names for things. That's always
Do you have any French ones thrown in
I
for that
do
region?
actually. I'm gonna butcher the pronunciation. Let me look at. I have them written down because I'm really bad at pronouncing French. I have the Ile de Feu, which is the Isle of Fire, which is in that southern area.
Uh-huh.
Um, there is the Étang des Sangues, which is like the Sangsus, which I think is like the Blood Lake. I'm doing this. If anybody who speaks French is listening to this, I apologize. Um, but yeah, there's a
They'd be
couple
mad
like
at you
that.
even if you were pronouncing it totally
Yeah,
correctly. Well, Parisians would be anyways.
yeah, I have a handful there for the Creole inspiration, and I'm trying to draw a little bit of mythology from these areas in the real world too. Trying not to do too much of that. Trying to make my own. I'm gonna have like a Latiche in the Gulf County, which is a Creole creature. I've got a Wendigo for the north, right? Inspired by
Mhm.
the Algonquin myth. So I've got some of those, but I'm trying not to do too much of just your bog standard mythology where I can.
There's a lot of different things you mentioned in your survey, and I guess the one that interested me most was the clocks,
Ah, yes.
which we don't mean like, clock on a wall that tells the time, but why don't you give us the spiel for what those are?
Yeah, they are clockwork people. Hence the name Clockworld. It's kind of where it all started was I know I wanted to be players to be able to be, a classic steampunk kind of robot person. So the clocks are people, just like anybody else. They awaken, though, as an adult out somewhere in the ruination, oftentimes. They're basically an artifact from pre Calamity, in a similar way that, say, the Warforged backstory is often used in Dungeons and Dragons, where they're an artifact from another time.
Hmm.
So these people wake up in their artificial bodies, and nobody really knows how they came to be. It's assumed that some of Elsewhere's influence probably made them. But they wake up with memories and thoughts and a personality and everything, and they just attempt to integrate into society. Um, but they can't reproduce, right? They're not a biological entity. But they can be killed and hurt, and they have emotions just like everybody else. And basically, the way it works is it's not a separate species that you pick at the start, but you can switch out one of your starting edges to be like, I was born a clock, and it changes how you start. But they're effectively just a person with some dressing over it. I didn't want them to be that mechanically different.
Do they look obviously like a steampunk android,
They
or are they
do.
okay? So they can't really hide it.
Nope, can't hide it. They're very artificial looking, even if they have analogous needs of a person, right? They need friendship and company and all that kind of thing. They look artificial. They got four arms, two eyes, a mouth, but they look steampunk robotic.
And you mentioned needs. I mean, you mentioned like psychological needs. So I was thinking like physical needs. Do they eat food or
They
something
they
else?
do need to eat actually. They have to fuel themselves. They need food and water. What they don't do is age, which is convenient. The problem is that they have trouble swimming because they are naturally much heavier than a person. But their body is a little bit more durable than a normal person, a little resistant to like cuts and piercing. Basically, there's any power, any benefit you get from being a clock is built into the edge you choose at starting. Like, I'm born a clock, this edge gives me these benefits, and it's in line and power wise with other options you could get.
It's interesting you mentioned like not aging because I feel like machines do age. Like
Yeah,
cars need a lot of love to work after like 20
they
years.
do. Yeah, the clocks, no one knows how to make them. They are, that there's robots in the world, and then there are clocks. The robots rust and deteriorate over time and, break down. And the clocks are made of something else, and people have not been able to determine like what their skin is made of. It's they're otherworldly in that way. Artificial, but otherworldly. As Elsewhere not only influences organic material, but also machines and thoughts. And so there's, possessed machines out in the world and all sorts of crazy stuff like that.
And how common are clocks? Like if you walk into your standard Western town, how
Yeah.
many people are going to be clocks?
They're about 5% of the population, so one out of every 20.
Okay.
They're pretty common. I mean, like, that's not crazy uncommon. There'd be one in every town easily.
Hmm.
There's not prejudice against them, really. I mean, they're just people at the end of the day, and they want to survive. So the game doesn't use it doesn't use clocks as an analog for like racism metaphors or anything like that. Because, like I said, I'm not
Okay.
interested in telling those stories
Gotcha.
in
Yep.
in my rootin' tootin' cowboy horror game.
Yeah.
So yeah, they're accepted for the most part because, like I said, they want the same thing. They want to survive.
And what about medical care for them? Is that because if no one knows how to make them, do they know how to fix them up?
Yeah, they can be patched up like a person. We even with limited knowledge of human biology, we can stitch them up okay. The in-game mechanic behind that is instead of the medical kit being the right tool for the job to treat their injuries, you need to use a tinker's kit. So there's just a
Ah.
small little mechanical nod. I just didn't want them to be that mechanically different from other
Mhm.
players, as I really wanted the game to reinforce we're all in this together, we're all the same, we're all just people. But I can't have a steampunk cowboy game without my robot cowboys
Right. Yeah.
in some form.
And the description you gave in the survey reminded me a lot of the plants from Trigun, if you've seen that anime series.
Oh gosh, it's been so long. I mean, that came out in like the '90s, right? Um,
Well, they did a sort of uh, remake of it
oh,
recently, but yes, it is an old series.
oh, I haven't seen the remake. Is the remake any good?
Yeah, it is. It's on
Oh,
Hulu. It's
oh, okay.
3D animation, but still kind of like that sort of 2D feel,
Right, right. Oh, cool.
and it pretty much tells the same story, but it's not just adapting it again. It does it with a few different
Oh,
pieces to
that's
it.
good. That's better to do it that way. Not, I mean, we don't need to talk anime right now, but I
Yeah.
like it when they do something unique when they come to it again, rather than just trying to recreate the magic of 30 years ago.
Hmm. Yeah, they're even talking about doing a second season for it instead of just
Oh,
ending on the
nice. I'll have
first
to check it
season. So
out.
they're expanding it.
Usually, if I'm watching anime, it needs to be something fairly cozy, because I don't watch a lot of stuff.
Mm,
Watching TV is something I do with my wife, and she doesn't like
uh-huh.
some of the weirder anime. So, we'll watch things like Freer and Journey's End or Delicious in Dungeon, kind of the more fun,
Right.
cuter side. She didn't like the original Trigun when I tried to show it to her, and I understood. I get it.
Yeah. Then she won't like this one either. Sorry.
That's fine. She's watched Cowboy Bebop and Samurai Champloo, like a lot of the really good stuff, but
Yeah.
Trigun just wasn't quite doing it for her. It's all good. I still love her.
Yeah. Yeah. But anyways, yeah, I was thinking of like, the human like plants in that show up out of nowhere. There's no in-universe explanation for
Yeah,
how they show up. And they're basically just as human as anyone else.
right, right.
And then, I mean, the series focuses on like that racism aspect, but from the plant perspective
Hmm.
for Knives, where he wants to like eliminate humanity,
Right.
and and
Yeah,
Bash does not. Um,
yeah, yeah. Yeah, I decided against doing something like that in my game. There are human on human violence in the game, but it's primarily from one of the like, bad human factions. I got my bandits, right, that aren't truly evil. They're called the Hundred Blue or Los Cientos Azules, and
mm.
they're just trying to survive in their own way by stealing from others. They're not like a rapacious band of murderers, but the
But
players.
nothing is like demographically motivated. It seems like what
Correct,
your stance
correct.
is. Yeah.
It's fighting over resources for the most part, or well, there's an evil cult, of course. In any game like this, you got to have an evil cult that lurks
Right.
under the surface of the towns. But they're just bad dudes. They're evil. They literally worship elsewhere and try to bring these horrors into the world, and they're really gnarly. So you'd want to stop them. Yeah, it's not demographic based. I actually don't think that tabletop role playing games are that well suited to exploring those kinds of subjects unless you go all in and make the whole game about that. It's not something I think you can just toss in lightly and have it be done respectfully. You got to take a measured approach to including such narratives.
Yeah. I feel like it can be handled, but you also have to think about this as like remember what you were doing when you were a teenager and first playing the game, like all the
Yeah.
crazy shit you did, and imagine that that's what someone will be doing with your game and whether they would handle
Yeah.
you as a 15-year-old would handle racism in a correct and well-balanced way compared to how you are now, and I feel like the answer is no.
Yeah, absolutely. It can be a cool place to work through that with a mature enough group, right? Who is interested in exploring it. There's this really cool Western tabletop game, and I'm blanking on the name. I should have looked it up beforehand. That is a rules light narrative game, and it is based in our world, but it's specifically about telling the stories of the people that built the West who have been forgotten by history. So it is all about surfacing and empowering those narratives. And it's not a horror game or an action game. That's really cool. And they went all in on that subject, right? And that's the point of the game, is to explore those narratives. Mine, I want my players to be running from zombies and shooting them, right? That's the goal of mine.
Right, right. Well, I did want to hear about the religions for the setting. And what I thought was interesting in your survey is you said that like pre-apocalypse religions didn't really survive. And I guess part of this questioning is that this is not Earth with like, Christianity, Judaism, Islam, Buddhism, Hinduism, etc. It's you have your own maybe whatever fantasy analogs within the pre-apocalypse. And I'm curious as to why none of those would have survived, because I feel like a lot of disaster traumatic events like whatever this apocalypse was, with Cthulhu rising out of the waters and someone
Yeah.
opening a portal to Cthulhu hell, is that even in something like that might still drive people to religion instead of away from it where they need to do something else.
Yeah. And I guess maybe the way I wrote it was a little misleading. It's that these religions as they existed before, they've all kind of coalesced because we just have like this small population that remains, right? It's maybe like 10,000 people is the whole, human population that we know of at the moment. Is that they've coalesced into a different thing now. Very much inspired a lot by real world Judeo-Christian religions. The Church of Ashes is a faith that inherited a lot of beliefs from, winking toward real world religions. And so there's a very strong faith component to the setting. It's just the religions of the before time haven't survived as they were. So there's aspects of the Church of Ashes that are very Catholic. But there's also beliefs that are more in line with Buddhism within them, et cetera, et cetera. There's a bit of an amalgamation to it of what's survived. Oh, yeah, because and it's in the setting. Well, the players aren't necessarily aware in fiction, but Elsewhere's influence has caused all these supernatural things to become very real. People's beliefs have real power now. And so you can take edges. They're in the supernatural category, but there are things like being able to hold up your holy symbol and to drive back evil, right? These things, or perform prayers that actually they have like a mechanical in-game benefit. And so characters of faith are still quite prevalent in the game. I was also trying to say, like, these religions of old, wink, let's not directly have Catholicism, Judaism, Islam. Like, here's a new thing. It's got some of the stuff from the old ones. Part of that is the just attempting to divorce too much, or to divorce as much as I can from real world religions, while still kind of gesturing toward it, right? Because in a Western, you got to have churches, right? They're so iconic. But I just didn't want to say like this is this is Catholicism. Like my game is Catholicism. Kind of see what I'm saying? Like I want to gesture toward it, but I wanted to shake the Etch-a-Sketch a bit narratively.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I feel like from third edition of D&D, like St. Cuthbert was kind of like that.
Yeah,
that was very much like a Catholic analog that was inserted into Greyhawk.
Yeah, and I'm very, I guess, well-read when it comes to religion. My degree is actually in philosophy. My emphasis was ethics and religion, like practically a theologian at this point. So, and part of all that knowledge was that I wanted to separate from those real world ones. But the Church of Ashes can still have your fire and brimstone side to it, right? Players, they pick up the game. They're like, "Ooh, I want to be a priest with a shotgun." I'm like, that works in the setting. As
Cool.
the church has um, it has its penitent acts, is what I call it. The church believes in charity, which is making sure that people stay fed, basically, right, in this world. There is the idea of proselytization, right? You should spread the good word and help people, again, to kind of increase this sense of community. And you should crusade against evil, the evil in your own heart and the evils of the literal evils, right, of the outside world. It's not a question if demons exist, right? I mean, well, look, there they are destroying the town.
Right.
So yeah, they're very active. They're not. I'm also not trying to do like, oh, this is a parallel to evil Catholic Church or something in my game. The characters of faith are supposed to be the good guys, and you can be one of them because there's plenty of evil to be had, right? In
Well,
this setting.
there's a question I feel like I skipped over here was like, how did the apocalypse occur that sort of generates all this stuff?
Right. It's in fiction, nobody is sure, right? There's theories, but basically human technology went too far. An inventor created a device. He had picked up readings of elsewhere, like, oh, there's this other reality, right? And this inventor ended up creating a machine to create a portal to that realm. And in doing so, he tore the barrier between our two worlds irrevocably. Irrevocably. Which basically that caused the calamity, as they call it. So it was the overreach of technology. And there's actually an artifact in the game. You can find like a prototype of that device with that basically lets you open portals and stuff like that. So it was humans' overreach trying to push technology to harness the power of elsewhere to connect to it, or the barrier between the worlds.
They dug too greedily and too deep.
I love that kind of stuff. I mean, it's most sci-fi is something like that, right? It's the human
overreach. That's very much what Dead Space is.
Yep.
Same exact thing, trying to get energy from some other dimension and then.
Yep. Whoops. Or the movie Alien, one of the greatest sci-fi horror movies ever made. It all would have been fine if they just followed protocol. But the company had their android make sure that somebody gets infected and then make sure it gestates, right? So they could use it and et cetera, et cetera.
What was that other new movie, Prey?
Prey was a Predator film that came out not that long ago that was set in I forget the year.
No, Life. That's what it was.
Oh, Life with is that one with Jake Gyllenhaal?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, same deal. It's told time and time again. I always love it, right?
Yep.
Yeah, so that was the cause. Is invention. This pursuit of technology ended up destroying everything.
Mm-hmm. And I feel like a lot of Lovecraftian horror has Lovecraftian deities that are like the leaders of this unholy crusade. Is that something that you've brought in as well, or is it more just like...
actually, I really like my Dagons and my Cthulhu's and all that. For my game, what I like the idea of is that elsewhere is just as corrupted and twisted by our physical realm as we are by it. So there are these entities that came through to our world, but they were changed by it as well. So they're called the wolves in sheep's clothing. There's 4 of them. And they were entities of, madness and godlike power in their world in elsewhere. But here they're made flesh. They're each a skinwalker. They're a shapeshifter. And they have this alien intellect to them. They can assume identities. They try to manipulate events, but they're subject now to all of our kind of garbage. Like they've one of them is just consumed by these feelings of rage and anger and emotion that we have, and they can't control it. They're not used to being these physical bodies. And so that one's called Curly Wolf, which is an actual Old West saying, a colloquialism for somebody that's real angry. And so they try to bring down society all the time. They just want to tear everything apart because they dislike this physical world. There's another one that's called Simon Pure, which was an Old West term for the real deal, the real McCoy. And this entity became obsessed with the accumulation of wealth, the accumulation of physical things that we do here. Third one is Gospel Sharp, which became obsessed with the concept of faith and belief and created the cult that is now one of the ubiquitous threats. Last one is Simon Pure, which is obsessed with science, with our pursuit in science. And some say that he's the one that whispered in that inventor's ear 100 years ago, getting him to push technology forward. So these entities are nearly unkillable. They could be anyone at any time, and they actively try to serve their own needs, and sometimes those needs interfere with each other. They're almost like siblings, like rival siblings. Did you ever watch the Doctor Who? I believe it was in Doctor Who where there was the family. This is an old episode. Well, anyway, it's a group of immortal people that are family, and they don't want to kill each other, but they constantly interfere with each other's schemes, like any good squabbling gods would.
Right. I think that's a theme that's pretty common for like immortal family tropes, is that they don't care about conflict with anyone else except themselves. Like I think that's in Altered Carbon, that's part of it.
Oh yeah.
There's that one immortal family you meet in Fallout 4 that's kind of like that as well.
Yeah, I love it. So yeah, that's the wolves in sheep's clothing, as they're referred to. These four, they're not really people. These four entities are in elsewhere they would have been the Lovecraftian gods, but here they're made of flesh, right? They're these physical things. Their natural state looks like The Thing from the movie The Thing. You know, a horrible...
That doesn't help me at all.
You know, they look like the twisted sort of hybridized goo monster that is in The Thing. But they can assume the identity of anybody they kill. And so they, you know, they're in society somewhere, always lurking.
This reminds me of kind of the Man in Black from Dark Tower a little bit.
Yeah, Merlin or the Man in Black, or I forget his other names. Oh yeah, big inspiration for these characters. The wolf in sheep's clothing called Simon Pure was inspired directly by the Man in Black initially.
Yeah, I was thinking that.
A manipulator who's in it to discover things and skew things in his favor. And it's kind of inscrutable. Like, why is he the way he is? Why is he such a jerk? Yeah. So Simon Pure is kind of was the first one of those I made. In the adventures, he shows up fairly regularly. Sometimes the players don't know they've been traveling with Simon Pure for weeks. He's just in the party and then reveals himself later, that kind of stuff.
It's also reminded me of the first from Buffy, if you've seen the last season.
Yeah. You're just tapping into all the stuff that's built my mind over the years, right?
Yeah, the first is different because they can't interact physically with the world.
Yeah,
but
these mine very much are very hands-on. They are part of the world. They're trapped on this world too, right? They're now a part of it, and they don't like it.
So do they have a goal of like getting back home, or?
Well, each one now is so consumed with their own obsessions that probably only Simon Pure is interested in getting home, as he's the one that is credited with maybe causing this cataclysm in the first place. But sorry, I may have said Simon Pure twice. The one that's obsessed with wealth is called Jim Dandy.
Okay.
Yeah, I think I said Simon Pure twice. Like Jim Dandy is too consumed with greed to worry about going home now. That's their obsession, is the accumulation of wealth in all of its forms, kind of Red Dragon-like. And so, you know, they might think, no, I don't want to go home. I have all my shiny stones here. While Gospel Sharp is less interested in going home as it is fully bringing elsewhere into our world in a more substantive way, like making this another elsewhere, et cetera, et cetera. They're schemers, but they're not, like, they're so fallible in their approaches, right? Because any grand alien intellect they had has been pushed through the Plato masher into our world and been twisted and corrupted by it.
So are they still able to control all the monsters?
Yeah, they are themselves horrors. That's like the creature type.
Uh,
And oh yeah, they actively will create more of them or summon them. There's a number of kind of science fiction hybrid monsters, like a robotic monsters. There's one called the Blood Oiler. It's basically a cyborg zombie, and Simon Pure is credited with making them in a lab. Like he can create them himself. So yeah, they
okay.
are very directly connected to adding more of these monsters and controlling them.
So it seems like then they don't have a goal of destroying the world because it feels like if they can just control all of the monsters, they would just do that.
yeah, yeah, it's more like they want this world to be theirs, more so than destroying it. Except maybe Curly Wolf, the one that's consumed with this passion, they might just try to burn it all down. But that's not like a good plan. It's just how they've been consumed, right? That's their obsession.
Okay.
Yeah, so they're not seeking to wipe the slate clean, but they are, hoping to convert human biomass to, something horrible.
Yep.
Yeah, not exactly on humanity's side.
You've been skating around the Blood Oilers a little bit. Let's talk about them.
Oh
Who
yeah.
are they?
One of the first creatures I made, like monsters I made for the setting. So blood oilers are, put quickly, a zombie cyborg. So they are a person that has been abducted and torn to pieces and rebuilt, pumped full of an oil that isn't just normal crude oil. It's some elsewhere infused goop that reanimates them. They have all sorts of extra appendages, cybernetic appendages attached to them. They've been made larger than a normal person. They're roughly like 8 to 10 feet tall.
I'm seeing your Magic the Gathering influence here.
Oh yeah, I maybe like the Phyrexians. I actually have a really cool concept art that I paid for one of these that I could send you. It's really gnarly, but they're one of the more deadly threats in the game. They have one big saw blade arm, they have a grabby arm, and their third arm is usually a syringe that has this oil in it. And when they inject it
Ugh.
into you, it paralyzes you and stops all your bleeding. It actually prevents you from dying so that they can abduct you. So they'll come in, they'll use this giant saw blade arm and like shear off a leg from a player, inject them with their poison to paralyze them and start dragging them off. So they're pretty gnarly. They're very hard to kill. They're covered in metal plates. They're covered in like oil drum pieces and that kind of thing, just dripping with this oil and very
Oh,
hard
the
to
metal
kill.
plates work for the Blood Oilers. Okay.
It works against the yeah it does. There's a special. But a good shot to the head still kills them. There's those still very much killable. But they're pretty scary. They're definitely one of the gnarly threats because a scene with them involves maybe a player going down, and they don't attack a down player to like kill them instantly. They'll start to take them away, and so the fight changes if a player is starting to be dragged off by a blood oiler. And
Uh-huh.
they've been a source of good spooky scenes for many playtests. They exist out. They basically will have a nest somewhere out in like abandoned oil fields underground where they'll drag people off to convert into more blood oilers. And they're none of who they were before exists. They've been killed. Like they are dead and reanimated. It's just the body at that point. Um, I wanted to make that clear because players tried to save one at one point. I'm like, no, 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 no. I appreciate it, but no, we're going to draw that line very clearly. There's no saving them at this point. They died. You can actually find still in process blood oilers. There's like a downgraded version that the players can interact with that is recently converted, and they have like a random behavior table, right? Because they're still in the process of being converted. But yeah, they're gnarly
Oh,
creatures. Yeah, they tear people apart and abduct them, and it's very, very scary, especially if there's NPCs that the players are trying to protect, and the Oilers are, coming out of the darkness to mutilate and steal people. So they're very
yeah.
cool. They're real gnarly.
Yeah, that does sound pretty cool. It's reminding me of Trigun again. So there's that one episode where Vash runs into a cyborg like that,
Yeah,
and
yeah,
he just has to try and redeem them, and it doesn't work.
right.
Yeah, seems very similar. But Plus the saw blade and the third arm and the needle and the oil and all that stuff too.
Yeah, totally.
It feels like a lot of the enemies that you've described so far are humanoid, or at least masquerade as humanoid for the wolves in sheep's clothing.
Right.
Are there any that are more of like the? I guess Cthulhuian horror was mostly humanoid as well, with like the exception of like Cthulhu itself.
No, I know what you're referring to. Yeah, there's some that don't have as direct human analogs to them. I still have things like there's some ghost-like enemies, right? I have some like that. There's one called the Arizona Tenor that is basically a tuberculosis ghost. But as far as Lovecraftian horror in that more classic sense, the one that's the most spot on for that is one called A Sight for Sore Eyes, and it is this flying tentacle creature with has three-sided symmetry with an eyeball on each side, but its eyelid is like a mouth, and it's really gnarly. And they can mesmerize people. Basically, they mesmerize them and lure them out into hazardous areas where they could like fall and break a leg, and then they feed on you.
Weren't like some biblical angels like?
Yeah, they have radial symmetry. It's really hard to parse how it's written when the angels show up in the Bible. It's very tough to like draw that. But I was inspired by the idea of strained symmetry for that kind of creature. Okay. One of my favorite weird creatures in the setting is one called a Kentucky Sawbones. And what it is a swarm of severed left hands or left arms that is an amalgam. So it hides itself in like a trench coat because it has, it can almost pass off in the night and walking by. Basically what it does is it can possess people's left arms and get them to pull their own weapon on themselves and try to kill them. And once it does that, the arm pops off and crawls and goes and joins the mass of severed left arms that is the Kentucky Sawbones. And there's no body underneath this mass. It's just these arms that have. You ever see? You ever seen Labyrinth? Back in the day,
long time ago. Yeah.
Well, there's a scene where Jennifer Connelly is in a pit full of hands, and they form a face out of hands, like it's a miming thing. Mm-hmm. This creature's like that. It's forming the rough shape of a body, but it's this swarm of left hands.
I thought it was going to be from the Blood Oilers, like they were, they got the saw blade that they were replacing, and then all the arms are. This is what happens to the arms.
Yeah, well, a Kentucky Sawbones, people aren't sure exactly what causes them to form, but one of the theories is discarded limbs from, say, Blood Oilers or from a battle, or from a medic's tent after a bad battle, right, where they had to amputate. But it's always the left, the sinister arm is always the one that pops up.
Of course, it's the sinister arm. Okay.
Of course. So they're very cool. They hide in a town, like they'll lurk in the cellar underneath the saloon, slowly trying to gain more arms, as they're not like a fighter. They're a sneaky creature. So they're more like the players would interact with this as a mystery. They'd go to a town and be like, why are all these people missing their arm? Right? Something's going on here. They'll have to try to track down the Sawbones because it doesn't need line of sight to possess people's arms. You just have to be within 100 feet of it. And so it'll be lurking somewhere in the town, and it'll be a race to try to find out where it is, all the while trying to resist, your own hands being possessed by the creature. Maybe they'll handcuff their arm behind their back or something, right? And creative solutions to it. That's a neat creature. So yeah, not a human analog, a really bizarre one of my favorites.
Yeah, that's cool. And having like the town of people that have like all missing their left arms and don't talk about it feels very much like Innsmouth to me.
Oh, that's absolutely. Cool. Oh, and it can also throw these arms at people, and they'll crawl like Thing from Addams Family. Like they'll crawl and try to strangle you and all that. So it can right. It can throw these arms out, right? So it can be messing with you and trying to kill you. And it's a whole deal like that. Yeah, very much used in scenes like Shadow over Innsmouth, right, where there's something off in the town. Maybe they're willingly sacrificing limbs to the creature. Who knows? Off the top of my head, I think those are the ones that are the most not human of all of them. There's a lot of mutated creatures, sure, that are all bizarre, but those ones are like the most out there, I guess you could say.
Well, I guess that's part of what makes horror interesting and not sort of irrelevant is having it be almost human and just be like a corruption of what we think is human.
Yeah, a lot of horror is, yeah, corrupting natural things, things that we expect or understand. I mean, even the zombie is a classic version of that. It is a person, but twisted and turned against us, and there's something really disturbing about that.
Yeah.
I mean,
Yeah,
I have
like
a
the most evocative zombie moments are always when like someone that a character loves
right.
is bitten and is going to turn.
Oh yeah, absolutely, a classic. The other one that I just remembered that is pretty cool. So one of my favorite creatures in Dungeons and Dragons is not loved by many. It's the Roper. I love that creature. I think it is
Hmm.
the coolest creature, and I have a version like that in my game that, the Roper hides among stalactites and stalagmites. I have a creature that can hide among things like cacti and try to drag you. Yeah. So this creature can basically inhabit things like cacti or houses. It can inhabit a number of things. But if it's in the cactus, it'll basically try to grab you and drag you through the cactus patch. And it's a tentacled creature that has a maw at its heart. Fun stuff like that. I was like, how can I make a roper even more gnarly? Oh yeah, have it be a cactus.
Give it some
Yeah,
spikes.
give it some spikes. I've got a really gross worm creature, like a small worm that'll try to crawl inside you. I'm just using my own, fears.
Hmm.
It's called a gutter whelk. Because one of my least favorite D&D creatures is the rot grub. I just hate that thing. I think it's the grossest thing ever. So I had to make one for myself. If you the gutter whelk, if it inflicts an injury on you, it crawls inside the wound and starts injuring you from the inside. And if it kills you, you explode with a bunch more gutter whelks coming out. So just extra
Ew.
gross. I know.
All right.
Every time I'm working on that creature, I just think I hate this. This is my nightmare. But I guess that's what you do with horror. You draw on your own fears.
Yeah. Well, skipping away from the horror aspect back
Yeah.
to the human aspect of the world. So you have these three counties. Do they have like basically all the same government system? You mentioned that they each had a
Roughly, yeah.
governor.
They basically have all democratically chosen just a person to run the joint. But they it's just from these small communities they've picked somebody to help lead them. They call him a governor because that's just, a word that culturally was still in use from the
Mhm.
before times.
Right.
But it's an elected official with no real specific term limit. But in the Wild West nature, if a governor is very corrupt and not helping the people, they'll probably just kill him.
Right. Yeah.
If you're not working for the betterment of the few survivors of the human race, they're not going to let you stay in town.
Right.
But yeah, it's roughly the same. They have a crude banking system. They've had some currency that they're using for trade, but most people still just like to barter. They don't need paper money. Just I'll trade my sack of wheat for some of your vegetables. That's how most of it works.
Yeah.
But it's roughly an elected governorship in each of these counties. The counties don't have like a firm county line per se. It's just roughly what they've been able to reclaim
Right.
and hold on to.
Okay. And the other interesting bit that you had for this was like sort of an outside government is Los Ciento Azules, who I would argue are a form of government. They
Yeah.
just don't, they're not official.
Yeah, there's technically two forms of alternative government out there. So Los Santos Azules or the Hundred Blue. When the story goes, the story they tell, the Hundred Blue, is that when the calamity occurred, a group of 100 people banded together to ensure their mutual survival. And they were from all walks of life, and they decided that, we're going to survive us 100 and screw everybody else, is what they said. Over the century that's passed, that has devolved into this large bandit organization. They still only look out for themselves, so to speak, but their noble initial intention of mutual survival has degraded into what is just banditry most of the time. So they have their own rules. They do exist within the counties themselves, living in there. And if they haven't committed any obvious crimes, they'll often just let them walk around because the local poor sheriff doesn't want to pick a fight with organized crime. But you see people walking through town with a blue bandana, blue scarf, blue gaban. Like, all right, maybe don't mess with those guys because they're part of this mafia, basically. But they don't try to they're not trying to destroy civilization or anything. They're just kind of trying to steal from it. They don't want to farm things. They want to take from the farmer. They'll have in classic sense, a farming community might have to pay their tithe to the local bandit lord,
Right.
usual stuff like, Magnificent Seven status.
Right. Another aspect to this that I was curious about is you said there's only like 10,000 people left, and if 1% of them are part of this organized crime, that feels like a high percentage to me.
Yeah, they are everywhere. It is they're like a big problem in that they're in every town, right? They're all over the place. And there's pretty much no banditry that's done that isn't the 100 Blue. Like, you can't just be a bandit on your own. Like, they're a force to be reckoned with. And if they could be convinced to use some of their strength for good, everybody would really benefit. But like I said, that noble intention that they started out with, being this almost military might, this strength, has just evolved into being a leech at this point. Yeah, they're a big problem. They're like one of the main sources of conflict in the game. Because there isn't like an army anymore, right? There's like militia in each of the counties, but it's just, your local guys, right? Picking up a gun. So yeah, it's a big problem.
How far apart are the counties if there's only like 10,000 people total? So like 3,000-ish each for each of them.
Let me look at my map because I think I roughly had this. There's about usually between maybe 100 miles between the borders of the counties, like where roughly the border is. Yeah, that separates them. Looks like 100 to 200 miles maybe.
So maybe like a week travel.
Yeah, if you had to do it on foot. Luckily, they do have trains that can go between the counties, but they don't run frequently because it's so dangerous. So yeah, travel between the counties is fairly limited. It takes time to do so. Now, there are some southern settlements, like in southern Langstrom County, you might be able to get a little close to the northernmost. If you plan accordingly, there might be areas that are a little closer to each other, but you're still looking at a lot of time out in the wilderness to get between them.
And the trains would take about a single day to go that distance?
Yeah, the trains can real cook between these locations, right? Because they can run all day, run all night. It's usually like one day and one night will get you to where you need to go pretty securely. They don't run super fast because they're all 100 years old and refurbished. Yeah, they basically run from the main settlements, the main cities in each of these counties. As each county has one city that survived the apocalypse that they've held on to. Yeah, so it's no small venture.
Right. Has the environment changed that much? Like the weather or the sky or anything like that?
Yeah, the weather is often supernaturally influenced. You can get freak storms. Your usual stuff, like out of nowhere, there's just hail. There are mountain ranges that were not on the maps before the calamity, for example. There are craters and lakes and pits and rivers that were shaped by this catastrophe. It's why if there were maps surviving from pre-calamity, they may not be that useful because so much of the terrain has shifted. But you get all sorts of evil weather. There's something called Devil's Breath, which is basically radiation. They don't call it radiation because they don't. These country bumpkins don't know what radiation is, but you can get these winds tinged with the devil's breath that start to like mutate and corrupt things that you need to take shelter from. It's all bad news out there. It's real inhospitable. Yeah, wildlife, plant life have been twisted in certain areas by elsewhere. Yeah. That's why like I said, mutation-free beef, super valuable. It is a common target of defense, right? We need to protect this train. It has like 6 mutation-free cattle to make sure that we can breed them or something.
Right. Well, yeah, is there anything else that you feel like I haven't talked about yet that you wanted to cover?
No, no. I mean, gosh, we've been talking for nearly 2 hours now.
Yeah.
And I can, talk on and on about horror movies and the setting. Yeah, no, I think we've covered everything. It's basically it's a Weird West setting that has a lot of horror elements to it, and then I made a injury system and a combat system that I thought would serve telling stories within it. It wasn't quite what I found in other games.
Yeah, it does seem well suited for the setting and the vibe that you're going for.
Yeah. My next the next project once I'm done with this Western setting is I want to make a medieval dark fantasy setting using this same structure. Still using Elsewhere as, make it a post-apocalyptic medieval setting. We're talking like Dark Ages, like early.
I feel like the Dark Ages is, in some sense, a post-apocalypse.
Yeah, exactly.
Already.
It's ripe for it. And, using this same combat system, the very gnarly kind of injury system, the grittiness of it, and making a fantasy, a more traditional, I guess you could say, fantasy setting using these rules would be really fun. My tentative plan is I'm going to have 4 settings that I already have kind of sketched out, and each will be cross-compatible, as in you could use the edges and the features from them and mix and match because they'll be using the same base structure. So you could do a Outlaw Star style setting by taking the magic from the medieval setting, the spaceships from the sci-fi setting, and the gunslinging from the Western setting. And boom, you've got your Outlaw Star anime. That kind of thing.
Cool.
Yeah, should be fun.
What's the fourth one that you're
the fourth one is inspired by Stranger Things is what most people will latch onto, but it's more specifically things like Erie, Indiana, and the X-Files. I want to actually apply my rules, the challenge of it, to make the whole campaign setting a single weird Midwest town, and just go super detailed on that town. And your professions in that setting would be things like babysitter, high school football star. Your culture would be like suburbs or out of towner, right? Incident would be my sister was abducted by aliens like Mulder, or it'd be really funny stuff like that. Use my rules to make a horror setting in a small Midwest town.
Okay. Yeah, I feel like there's a lot of different places for inspiration for that.
Yeah, we're living in actually a pretty good time for creative horror overall, especially things that harken back to the late 70s or 80s, which is, I think, one of the golden ages of horror.
Well, I always close out with asking the guest for a bit of DMing advice that they want to share. So do you have anything you want to shout out to people here, Peter?
Yeah, that's a tough question, actually, to think of one thing to give people advice about DMing. I think I'll give advice for new DMs specifically, and that is don't be married to the narrative you thought you were going to tell, and to be open to the narrative that you and your friends are creating. I made that mistake when I was young. I had an idea on what the story should be, and it closed me off to what the story could be that I was creating with my friends.
Yeah, I think it's difficult to do that if you have something cool that you want to do in your own mind, but letting your players be a real active part of the narrative that way ends up creating a really good story, especially if you can wrap it in with your own thing, obviously.
Yeah, right. It's so much more fun. The players will have more fun, and you'll end up having more fun. Sometimes the best NPCs you ever will make will be made up on the spot because you forgot to do a thing, right? And then the players will love them, and they'll be talking about them a decade later.
Yeah. Well, cool. Thanks for coming on the show, Peter.
No, my pleasure. Thanks for having me on. It was super fun. I love chatting about this stuff, and people who have seen some good movies too and have good taste in anime.
Yeah, thanks.
Yeah, all right. Good talk to you. Have a good night.
Thank you for listening. I've seen a lot of growth in the show over the last few months, and I'd like to keep it going. You can help by rating and reviewing the show on your favorite podcast app, telling a friend, or by telling any game masters you know to send in a survey to be on the show. You can find that survey at gocorral.com/STS. That's GOCORRAL.com/STS. If what you've heard from Peter sounds interesting and you want to play or take a look at the rules, you can find more about the system at talesfromelsewhere.com.